Cupolas are a wonderful part of Baroque architecture. These lovely rounded dome-like structures stacked on each other, forming wonderful towers and spires. Stacked is the right word. They can become quite complex and quite large, although they're also used for very small architectural elements as well. But the shapes that give them such interest can also make them tricky to draw. So we're going to look at some much simpler examples to learn the principles, and then we'll come to these more complex ones in a further video. We'll start with this simpler cupola. The most helpful approach I find, because they are quite complex shapes, is to simplify the shapes as much in our mind as possible. And I think of two ways of doing that. One is to align them all vertically, and the second is to see them as a series of individual stacked shapes that are all stacked or threaded on our center line. So in this tower, what shapes do I see? I see this top spire, and then I see a base around it. This base has diagonally cut corners, and then there is a rectangular latticework bell tower under it. Again, the corners are cut. And then under that, we have a squared off dome section. And then under that, we have a slight indented section that pulls back in underneath that dome. And then under that, we have a collar that flares outwards. And on top, there's a crown, because this is a church where Holy Roman emperors at one stage were crowned. So this is the way I visualize these structures in my head before I start to draw them. Usually I'm drawing them from the ground up, so to speak. But I always visualize, and it usually put a dot on the paper where the top of the structure will be in order to get it nice and straight. Of course, if I were drawing this, I wouldn't leave the gaps between the different sections. I would draw them flush with each other. But this is the way I think it becomes like a children's building set to assemble. I find that by taking the cupola section by section, I can concentrate on each lot of proportions. If the proportions are each correct, then I use that as a basis to define the size of the next section. Again, seeking to get the proportions correct based on what I've drawn underneath. Let's look at another cupola. This one is slightly at an angle and from below, but we'll draw it as if we're looking straight on, and it's symmetrical. And to show how I think about this, how I picture this in my head, I'll put a center line because it is a tall, thin one. How do I segment this? Well, I can see here that down below there is a slight outward collar. So I'll put that collar in. Now, if I'm looking at this section, which happens to be darker, it's basically this sort of shape. Now, it's very slightly rounded. And then above this, if we look at these two sections, again, I'm working on my center line. We can see that it curves out in this way. And that takes us to here. Then if we want to come up further, we can see that it curves the other way. And now we have two sections in the upper part of this spire part on top. We have a section that comes in slightly, but then on top of that we have a section that tapers in more dramatically. And then on that we have two more sections, one that comes out and then one that comes in. And then we have a circle on top. I forgot for a minute that I was drawing it side on. And then we have the very top part. And so here we have what is quite a complex set of curves, which strangely enough though create a relatively simple shape to look at, but quite a challenging one to draw. So by analysing the shapes and working out where the curves change direction, we can perhaps get a more accurate silhouette or outline than just trying to draw it freehand. Now if we're drawing in pencil, we can put our centre line in, or we can give some indication of a centre line. We can usually put some marks up the top here that are going to be disguised by the top of the spire, and then just visually keep a sense of where the centre is, or even just put a few dots going down. So here we have another relatively simple to look at cupola, but slightly more complicated to draw. Again, we want to have a sense of a centre line so that we can keep whatever we draw stacked nice and symmetrical. So we have the base of the tower, and we have this collar. However, unlike in the earlier example, this collar actually curves down, which is a nice detail to capture because that emphasizes the roundness of our dome. Now we look here and we see that it changes direction about here. So that's what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to capture that change of direction. And we can see that from here to here is a little bit more than from here to here. And now we have a curve coming the other direction. And the cupola appears. Our final example is ones where the shapes are not so complex, but there is a lot of stacking that takes place. So we'll start with our centre line, and we'll start from the base going up. We're viewing this from an angle, but we can see that this line here actually goes up the centre of the front on view we're going to draw. So we'll just start with the top of the tower. So we've got this first section here, and there is an angled corner there. Now we have this collar section in here, where there's a little collar that sits there. It's important to capture these spaces, as I like to think of them. They're like little collars or washers even. Now for this section here now, even though we're not looking straight on, we know that the profile of this spherical section will be the same as what we see here. And there is a section that and now here again there is a collared section. And now we have the bell tower sits on top, this part here. We've wobbled slightly from our centre line because our centre line actually drifted a little when it was drawn. So now here there is a part that comes out under there, and then this comes out again. Now we have this little roof section. Now we have a section that curves in the other way. And now we have another squashed sphere, as I sometimes think of them as. And then on that, there's another little rise. So there we have it. So the technique I use for these Baroque cupolas is to see the shapes that are stacked, particularly paying attention to these, if you like, little in-between shapes that sometimes are quite small, but sometimes they end up taking quite a lot of space up when they're placed on top of each other. These are the things that give separation to the larger elements of the cupola. And these are the principles that we'll use in tackling some more advanced examples later on. You will find these 4 reference photos on my YouTube channel community page if you want to have a go at drawing them yourself. If you do, I suggest that you start with the simplest one and work through to this one. G'day, I'm Travers. Hope you have fun doing this. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.